When a group of scientists and advocates signed on to a report about the dire situation of the Great Salt Lake in the weeks before the 2023 legislative session, they didn't see it as risky or presumptuous. They were looking at the pattern of decline in the lake's elevation on a graph and in person. And if you followed that line of progression, in 5 years, if nothing was done, the lake was on track to disappear as we know it. Those were the words they used. But then, and not that long after, the conditions changed. We had an incredibly wet winter, and some people, like the governor, figured these scientists and advocates had overreacted and oversimplified the complex dynamics of climate change. And either way, they certainly had gotten it wrong. Ben Abbott and Bonnie Baxter helped write that report, and recently they explained to us why. Abbott is an ecologist at Brigham Young University, Baxter a biologist at Westminster University. Now, they knew things were bad, but when they went to a conference about the lake, the Salt Lake County Watershed Symposium, this was in October, they realized it was worse than they thought.
Contrary to public opinion, scientists are actually extremely conservative. Even when things are really bad, they're couching it in terms of, okay, what's the likelihood of this happening? And in fact, presenter after presenter, right? The bird team got up and talked about the threat to migratory birds. The dust team got up and talked about how 2/3 of the lake bed was exposed. The hydrological team got up and said, groundwater's depleted, reservoirs are empty, there's nothing we can do. The brine shrimp team got up and said, we're right at the threshold. The shrimp aren't going to be able to reproduce. The brine flies are going to have problems. And I was just absolutely floored. It was clear Great Salt Lake wasn't about to collapse. It was collapsing. And Bonnie and I and several others started talking about what can we do, because it's clear we've got to get the word out.
I was thinking about a one-pager for legislators that I thought would be helpful. And then Ben and I had this conversation, and it became clear that he was envisioning something bigger with lots more people and this advocacy slant. And I said, well, why don't we take what I've been writing and, you can have it and add it to that report. And so we both had been thinking about how can we be most helpful to policymakers.
And so we started working on this report that was really oriented toward initially legislators and the executive branch of government. And then we realized we needed to bring it to the people of Utah. And we realized we wanted it to go beyond the physical and biological science to include what's happening on the policy side, on the community organizing side. And there was a lot of urgency because with a system like this, right, Great Salt Lake used to be the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere. Now it comes in spot number 2. But you can't just turn the lake around in a year, right? If we want to have a chance of changing anything, we've got to be out ahead of it. And we were already up against the wall. And in fact, the scientific consensus was the lake doesn't have 5 years. It might only have 5 months until it crosses those salinity thresholds. And so we felt like if this is going to have any chance at influencing decision-making and being useful to legislators, it's got to come out before the session.
And there was nothing disingenuous about that.
In fact, a whole section of the report was about the really meaningful progress that had been made, the legislative changes.
Yes.
And it was about accelerating the efforts that were made, trying to be useful about identifying flow thresholds, right? One of the most sensitive questions is how much water do we need to conserve? What's the sustainable inflow to Great Salt Lake to ensure that the Wasatch Front and beyond remain this oasis that's livable for human flourishing, right? So this really was a piece about trying to identify what are the recommendations that we can all get behind, that really don't seem controversial, but that would be adequate to solve the problem, to reverse the lake's decline. I think that there is a stodgy and really unhelpful idea that somehow scientists are just generating objective information.
And it's best exemplified by, in my worldview, about the Manhattan Project. There are all these scientists from all over the world who were working at Los Alamos on the atomic bomb. And when we bombed civilian centers, they were like, well, we just worked on the science. We are separated from the outcome. And the idea that science is non-biased is dangerous because it's an endeavor of humans. And it can't be this objective thing. You cannot subtract yourself from it.
Imagine if your doctor brought you in and said, okay, you've got a tumor that's touching these 3 organs, and then leaves you there. Doesn't give you the diagnosis. It would be absolutely unconscionable. So here we are looking at the state of the lake, recognizing as we compare it to the Aral Sea, Lake Urmia, Lake Popo, that the consequences are genuinely existential.
If you see something going on that the public ought to know about, I have a responsibility to tell the public that funds me, and I also have a responsibility to tell the public in words that make sense to the public.
It's not a process of dumbing down the message.
Correct.
I don't even think it's a process of removing nuance. It's distilling the message and translating it into a form that's comprehensible. That's what's ethical. I didn't expect at all the blowback, and I also didn't expect it to go international in its attention.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Last week on the show, we had with us Matthew LaPlante. He's one of the journalists who co-wrote and produced a series for the Salt Lake Tribune and a podcast for Utah Public Radio that raised questions about the report that scientists had presented to lawmakers. Now, LaPlante didn't say they had acted in bad faith, just that they didn't take into account the other factors besides human consumption that had contributed to the condition of Great Salt Lake, like the long-term pressure of climate change and the role of groundwater in recharging the lake. So today in the program, Ben Abbott and Bonnie Baxter are going to respond to that critique. Now, we're going to begin with a few ethical issues Baxter and Abbott have raised about the Tribune and Utah Public Radio series. We've sent these along to Matthew LaPlante for a response. You can find it on our website for this episode, radiowest.org. Here's Bonnie Baxter.
The first thing that everyone should know was that our voices were recorded under false pretenses and were used on the podcast without our permission. We were asked way back in August if we would do an interview on the current state of the lake, given that it had had a couple of recovery winters. How are things? And so we interviewed with the Tribune reporter, Clarissa Casper, on Zoom, and she asked if she could record the Zoom meeting for her notes. And so we were not told that the series of articles would be about a groundwater study. We were never shown that study or asked to comment on it. And we were not told that our voices would be used in a Utah Public Radio podcast. I've never before had that happen. I've had journalists tell me explicitly the angle of the story or how my voice would be used. And so that feels very violating, and I feel like there was a breach in journalistic ethics. So those were my feelings when I first heard it. Was, first of all, I'm texting Ben, how did they get our voices? I didn't remember being recorded months ago. And then the way we were mocked, the way we were called unethical, and that we were just doing this for a splash. And then the reporter, Clarissa, when interviewed with Matthew LaPlante, said that scientists told her that she was going to die of lead poisoning in the next 5 years. We never talked about lead. It was all just this splashy podcast that questioned our ethics and our motivations and, mocked us. And I felt it was very irresponsible.
You know, I read the first piece in the Tribune, part 1 of the 3-part series. And initially I thought, maybe this is, setting up an interesting reveal that'll happen in part 2 or part 3. And then I noticed that it was based on a podcast and went to listen to the podcast. And I I was just really concerned because the podcast over and over misattributed the reason why Great Salt Lake is declining. They said that this is primarily climate change. And that's absolutely contrary to the bulk of the scientific literature on this topic. In fact, there was a paper back in 2017, 2018 that came out that sloppily did the same thing. It said, Great Salt Lake's declining because of climate change. And there's a whole spate of papers that responded in the scientific literature, as we do, right, and said, actually, look at the data. Look at where the decline started. Look at is it correlated with temperatures or correlated with how much water is being diverted. And they found that at least 2/3 and likely up to 80% of the decline is from consumptive water use. And that's more than just a technical error. It strikes to the center of whether we can influence the fate of the lake. And so I became really concerned about that. Are people going to listen to this and basically check out and say, okay, it's not in our hands. It's about emissions from China. It's not about our lawns and fields of alfalfa.
I want to ask you about something. Ben, you have said, I think there is a real science and science communication problem. Mm-hmm. So I think I get, based on your response there, and we'll get to more of the real science question. But what's the science communication problem?
Yeah, so the science communication issue is twofold. First of all, the ethical issues that Bonnie raised. And for me, the number one issue was Matthew never reached out to discuss his study with us.
Never.
You know, we could have had a really interesting discussion. We could have asked questions about his study, right? And we could have gotten to a place of mutual understanding, even if we disagree.
I think more importantly, he should have reached out to the other people in the state who are working on groundwater. I mean, there's current mapping operations going on. I'm on all the state committees that deal with Great Salt Lake. We talk about groundwater all the time. I've never seen him at any of these meetings. Like, if that's what you're interested in, we weren't the right people to contrast your study with. And I think also thinking that this report that we did was the same thing as a published scientific study, it wasn't. And I have plenty of those, but not on this issue because I don't work on groundwater. So I feel like if someone really wanted to do an interesting discussion of groundwater, it should have been that instead of punching down on us in order to inflate this one paper.
How much thought went into this one sentence, the one that seems to have gotten everyone's attention, the one sentence that says, the lake as we know it is on track to disappear in 5 years? Yeah. Did you think that was going to be the headline that would persist for weeks? And how much thought went into that? Did you think that would be the one that caused the stir? Because that was having a finite number. Mm-hmm. I have to say, as someone who saw it, did make you pay attention. Yeah. So how much thought went into that? Because we should say out of a 34-page paper, you only say that pretty much once. You repeat it, it's in the executive summary, then it's repeated in the actual body of the report itself. But tell me about that.
Yeah. We basically had the bulk of the report written by the beginning of Christmas break. And it actually shows how good at marketing we are. We're like, let's release it between Thanksgiving and Christmas. People will read it. Right. So, but we had the report ready weeks before we finally released it, largely because we were debating that specific point. We had
sentence?
That sentence.
Wow.
We had a version of the executive summary that used more general language, right, about us being close to the edge, us on the lake being very close to thresholds. And we went back and forth with that. And there was really active discussion and criticism. We didn't go through a formal peer review process, but we shared the report with many scientists around the state and asked them for their very frank opinions. And we got feedback on both sides. Like, look, if you include this, it's going to become the focus, right? Because you're laying out a specific timeline. Now,
so you were warned.
We were warned for sure. And this had come up in our internal discussions as well. It's not a prediction. It's a scenario, right? And it says if the current rate of water depletion continues, then we've got 5 years left. For me, and I'd love to know your thoughts, Bonnie, but for me, what pushed me over the edge was when I realized the two messages that we could say are Great Salt Lake could die next year, or the lake as we know it, its ecological functions, its economic and cultural importance could disappear in the next 5 years. And partly in a nod to the fact that you can't predict weather from year to year, we decided to go with that more conservative language.
What did you mean by disappear? Because I think what people heard, certainly Governor Cox seemed to have heard by disappear, is you crazy scientists think in 5 years that thing is going to be a dry lake bed.
Yeah. We definitely didn't mean the scenario of total desiccation will happen. On the other hand, it's really hard to understand millions of acre feet of water. And so I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and she's very financially responsible. And we have discussions sometimes about, okay, you've got $200 in your bank account. If you keep on spending $40 a month, how many months do you have till it's gone, right? That's a way of making it concrete and actionable. And so we were saying, based off of the last few years, combination of water use and drought, we're losing 1.2 million acre feet of water from the lake each year. And there's about 5 years left at that rate of spending in the lake. And again, not a prediction. If it was a prediction, we would have said, long before the lake is gone, it's too salty for life to persist in it as we know it, right? It collapses. Long before it's gone, there are more and more dust hotspots and we're dealing with air quality issues. Long before it's gone, we lose the source of water vapor that accounts for 50% of the rain and snow that falls in the valley. We know from just recent research.
I think that's the thing that I hovered over was the 5-year thing. I didn't care one way or the other about that because we were already seeing the system collapse. In 22, we were already seeing bird populations, decimated. We were already seeing the brine flies gone. We were already seeing that happening. And so the 5-year thing didn't even matter to me. What mattered was that we let people know that this was an emergency.
But what happened was you issue this report with all its urgency, with all of these recommendations, and with the sentence that says, if the trend continues, that lake is going to disappear within 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then there's a massive snow year. Mm-hmm. I want to get your sense of how you reacted. Surely you were happy that it was a good snow year. Yeah. But what most people read was, these guys were wrong.
Doug, I remember I had a friend text me and say, hey, I just heard your name mentioned on Ben Shapiro's show.
Wow.
I was like, what? Ben Shapiro was mocking us. Because we talked – I used the term miraculous as far as the short-term rebound of the lake. Yeah. Right? Because in 2022 we had no options. We could have spent as much money as we wanted to. There was no water to get to the lake. That winter gave us the raw materials that we needed, water, H2O, to actually do something about it. So, no, I was just absolutely thrilled. Felt like we've learned our lesson. Our bank account almost bottomed out. Now we've got this windfall profit. We're going to use it in the most important way. We're going to make sure that water gets to the lake.
But you didn't worry that the message you had sent that 5 years it will disappear if the trend line continues is going to be misread? Because when you heard Ben Shapiro and Spencer Cox ultimately calling your not prediction but assessment that it would disappear in 5 years a joke.
Yeah.
Surely you were concerned about that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I took that not personally, right? We're sharing information. We're laying out a scenario. We're hoping that things change. So for me, it wasn't personal. What concerned me about Governor Cox's comments was that's an indicator of what the dialogue is in the halls of power. So this showed me that they'd taken their eye off the ball. And then we saw through the year, the Stegner Symposium address was alarming in several ways, this evolution where it became the scientists are alarmists, they're doomers, they never believed this, it was deceptive. I hope that they come back to the realization Great Salt Lake remains in a state of collapse. It remains on life support today. We're reaching the level that we were at in 2021, just 1 year before it bottomed out.
While we're on the subject of Governor Cox's comments at the Stegner Center Symposium, I want to play you a moment from that.
We have to, again, understand the people of our state and the legislators of our state and how to accept truth, how to know what that truth is, with all the exceptions and caveats that you understand. And it's okay to share those exceptions and caveats. Trust me, people can handle this. And admitting that you may not know everything and that you may be wrong and that you're only 60% sure or 75% sure or 80% sure will actually strengthen your argument. And if you happen to be wrong, that will be well received. And admitting when we're wrong actually builds trust.
It seems like what he's saying is just say it. If this is a little bit more complicated than we may have suggested in the report and we got it wrong. Why do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, the sentence that you cited earlier starts with that caveat, right? Mm-hmm. It starts with saying, if the current rate of water depletion continues, this is how much water we have left. That was the point. And I think,
but you feel your point is we weren't wrong.
We weren't wrong.
Yeah.
No. Again, if anything, I ended up in a place, as we discussed, whether to include that line, of feeling like maybe we are burying the lead here. By giving that just like Bonnie said, the lake was collapsing. And the title makes that clear, right? Emergency measures needed to reverse the ongoing collapse of Great Salt Lake. They're needed now. It's an ongoing collapse. So I was worried, if anything, that this made people feel like we've got 5 years before we need to do anything.
Here's my take after teaching for 28 years. I'm sick and tired of people telling me that scientists just produce a list of facts or they prove things. There's not one science paper you can find that says I proved this. They say things like the data suggest, the data are consistent with. They don't say the data prove this. Look at our list of facts. So science is a process and it is not a product. And I think treating science as something that is just collecting evidence to give us the best truth as we go along is the right way to think about science. And so to suggest that scientists don't include nuance tells me that he really hasn't read a science paper. And I don't blame him because I haven't read a legal brief. So, you wouldn't read a science paper unless you were a scientist. So the depiction of what a scientist is and what a scientist does is quite different. And he also was talking about conflicts, as I remember, between scientists and the people working in the state agencies. And, a lot of the people who work in the state agencies that manage the lake are scientists. So, yeah, scientists just aren't in ivory towers.
You bring up such an important point, Bonnie. Both of us work at private universities. We're independent, insulated from politics at a level that many of the scientists in the state aren't, because so many of them are in state agencies or at state universities. And I certainly felt a personal responsibility to give as objective an assessment as I could in that report. Again, not to say other people's assessments are wrong, but to say here is the way that we see it right now. And we're going to try to be as clear as possible. We're not going to try to cover it up. We're not going to try to erase that nuance. I mean, again, if you look at the report, we're not just relying on that very simplistic calculation of how much water is left in the lake. We're comparing Great Salt Lake with other saline lakes around the world who have been right at this point, right? And none of them have been turned around. And so fundamentally for me, we continue to underestimate how hard this is going to be to save Great Salt Lake. We continue to live in denial about how serious the consequences of failure are. And what I heard from Governor Cox at one level was, let us politicians control the narrative, provide the information to us, but we know better how to message this. And it's not a sign of – I wasn't trying to be disrespectful, but in a vibrant democracy, representative republic, whatever you want to call it, I think each of us as a citizen has a responsibility to contribute our view.
Ben Abbott is an associate professor of plant and wildlife sciences at Brigham Young University. Bonnie Baxter is a professor of biology at Westminster University, where she's the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute. We'll take a break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today's show is the second part in a conversation about the Great Salt Lake and what the science tells us about its future. Recently, a series in the Salt Lake Tribune and Utah Public Radio raised these critical questions about a report that said the lake was on track to disappear in 5 years, and whether that report damaged the public's trust in science after a very wet winter hit. We have with us two co-authors of that report, the ecologist Ben Abbott and the biologist Bonnie Baxter. The Tribune Utah Public Radio series didn't just suggest you weren't nuanced enough in that report in the presentation you made to lawmakers and the public. It also suggested that there were some factors related to climate science that you didn't address, didn't add into the equation, and I want to talk about those and the consequences that may have had for that you didn't take into account or somehow misread the fact that there could be a snowpocalypse in a few months after the report came. LaPlante told us something his advisor and collaborator, Simon Wong, told him. I want to read this. He mentioned on our show, he said, in 5 years when this doesn't happen, people aren't going to remember which scientists said it would happen. They're just going to remember that some scientists said it did happen. And we're going to be wrong in their eyes, and they're not going to trust us. How do you respond to that?
I think that's very dramatic. I give people more credit than that. I've done a lot of reaching out to the public. I would say I'm rather unusual for a scientist that way. I have talked to a lot of people, and I can't tell you the number of phone calls and handshakes and emails that I have gotten that have thanked me for bringing the lake's health to their attention. And I think that that's an important part of my responsibility, that scientists shouldn't just be in their laboratories, but they should make their work and their observations digestible for the public. I just feel pretty strongly about it.
Strongly the what? That you didn't jeopardize the reputation of all scientists by by the fact that there was a big snowstorm.
I'm pretty sure that most of us can discern that all scientists are not horrible because we gratefully got a big snowstorm in 23. I'm pretty sure that we can figure that out.
Yeah, I agree. If we had made a prediction about what was going to happen and it didn't, then absolutely. I think it'd be really important to say we were wrong. We didn't consider groundwater. As it happens, groundwater is implicitly included if you look at lake level, right?
Yes,
lake level is a consequence of overland flow and groundwater.
Yeah.
And so even though it hadn't yet been quantified, right, the reason why we didn't include groundwater is those estimates hadn't been published yet.
Here's the stuff that LaPlante and Casper say you disregarded or you didn't include. The natural ebbs and flows of precipitation in the surrounding mountains, and in particular the sort of long-term pressures of climate change and how that works. What is the main reason the Great Salt Lake is receding? This is the big question.
Yeah.
Is it climate change or is it overconsumption and too many diversions? This seems like the biggest area of dispute between LaPlante and Casper and the conclusions you came to. What LaPlante told us is that, of course, consumption has something to do with it, but that really most climate scientists will tell you the primary driver of a receding saline lake in the Salt Lake Valley is climate change. It's not the amount of alfalfa and how we irrigate our lawns. It's climate change, like it or not. All right, what do you say to that?
So look at the Aral Sea. It dried up because of the multiple countries that share that watershed. They started growing cotton and apples and started diverting water for agriculture. And the lake dried up. A lot of people are still breathing a lot of dust. There's a lot of health implications there. Lake Urmia in Iran, same thing. Agriculture sucks the water. The lake dries up. You see this in saline lakes all around the world. Ben and I were just at an international saline lakes meeting where we were working with scientists from all over the world studying various saline lakes, and I've been to this conference several times before. So we have an international community of people studying this problem. So you can sort of, first of all, say, well, the stakes are pretty high because this is happening everywhere. And as Ben says often, none of these lakes have been saved. So could we be the one to do it? Like, could we model that? And Brian Steed really loves that. He latches onto that.
He's the commissioner of the
Great Salt Lake Commissioner in the governor's office. And he also says that a lot. Like, this would be great if we could be a model for the world on how to save these lakes. So there's no question in all of these systems that have been studying that agriculture is having the largest immediate impact. But Simon Wang, who Matthew LaPlante worked with, I had him come give a talk at Westminster a couple years ago, and we spent some time talking and followed up on a couple of things. He's done some really cool work looking at the Colorado River groundwater and Great Salt Lake groundwater depletion. And if you think about it that way, why would both those things be depleting? And he points to climate change. So I think there's been a lot of great groundwater studies in the last couple of years that look at the whole of the United States, groundwater depletion under the Midwest, where we grow our crops. Groundwater is being depleted. Yes, climate change, but also yes, agriculture. And
wait, I'm not following.
So
are you making a case for climate change or for human consumption?
Both things.
Okay.
Both things, because both things involve groundwater, right? So groundwater is being depleted all over our nation, all over the world in various systems. I don't study it. That's not my field. But I've entertained speakers. I've read papers. I see this all the time, groundwater depletion. It's happening. It's not always because of climate change. It's also because we're drawing too much water out of the aquifers. So all of these things are connected. And we don't yet understand the groundwater under Great Salt Lake. We don't know where it's all coming from. We don't know which rocks it's moving through. We don't know how much salinity it's bringing. This is a really cool problem. And all the people studying groundwater really should be talking about it, right? That's not me. I'm not studying that. But I know that there are studies that show agriculture depletes groundwater as well as climate change. So I don't think it has to be, is it this or that? It's all the things.
But it's okay. It's all the things. Yeah. Is that true?
No.
Not to put you in the case of,
no, for sure.
In the position of disputing what Bonnie Baxter is saying, but
we're scientists. We love to dispute.
Okay, great.
Oh, yeah. And it's not my field. And
okay, so what you are saying
what I'm saying is
quite the opposite.
That's right. It's really clear.
Yep.
The decline of Great Salt Lake is because of human water consumption. And one of the mistakes that I think Matthew in his study makes is, okay, we're going to understand the groundwater piece a little bit more. And the way we're going to do that is let's take out diversions from the equation. Let's just look at how the lake behaves without human water diversions. And lo and behold, it shows a very, very gradual decline. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's what we've seen. When we do attribution, when we look at how much water do we know is being consumed versus how much has temperature increased and evaporation increased from the lake, the human water diversions have lowered the lake level by 15 feet. This is brand new work, Madeline Merck and David Tarbotten out of Utah State. 15 feet. The lake would be 15 feet higher today if not for human diversions. So it would be at its long-term natural average of 4,207 feet. If you do the same thing and isolate out the climate signal, how much has increased evaporation from the lake decreased the lake level? The answer is 0.3 feet. So yes, climate change is affecting the lake, and that will become more important as we go into the future, right? The projections specific for this watershed, which do exist, show that we're expecting around a 15% decline in natural river runoff by the end of the century.
So what I'm hearing is both things, but the proportion is really different than what is represented in that one study. And I think many studies support that.
Yeah.
Why is that such an important question? The different. This is a leading question for you.
Yeah.
Because I think I know the answer. Why is that such an important question? That it's climate change or consumption? Why is that an important question? Why does it matter to you to be able to convey the thing that you believe, which is, yes, climate change is a factor, but the real thing driving this is consumption? Why is that so important?
Climate change is a problem that we have to solve at a global scale, right? The atmosphere is the biggest global commons on the planet. The Great Salt Lake watershed represents a fraction of 1% of the surface area of the U.S. So we've got to manage water use here. Completely different set of solutions. So it's central. It's not a question of esoteric scientific debate. Are we able to solve this problem locally or not? It's really, really crucial. And that's why I'm so concerned about this. You asked earlier about the science communication. The issue here is it's not just that we're getting the rate of decline wrong. We're getting the cause of decline wrong. And so we've got to live within our means. And this is not a marginal view. It has been confirmed by literally dozens and hundreds of studies that have asked this exact question.
Ben Abbott, can I quote your colleague there to your left, Bonnie Baxter from the Salt Lake Tribune? She wrote this in a piece recently. Because we cannot act quickly to alter global warming, and because the mega drought conditions are out of our control, we have only one lever left to pull. We must decrease our use of water for development, industry, and agriculture. That's what you're getting at, right? It's that one lever.
That's right.
That's all we can control.
But what I'd add is getting back to this idea of disclosing things as scientists. We need to disclose, okay, it's the one thing we can do and it's not going to be enough. Right? I think that's Matthew's conclusion. Looking at the best available data today, I come to the opposite conclusion. We absolutely can not only reverse the decline of Great Salt Lake, we can make it resilient to future climatic changes if we reduce the amount of water we're consuming.
Here's another thing you said, Bonnie Baxter, in the Tribune, is that what we should expect is an increasingly drier and warmer environment.
Yes.
But is that right? Because what LaPlante and Casper say in their reporting on this, in getting at their sense of the variability of climate change and how difficult it is to really pin down exactly what is going to happen and predict what might happen in 5 years or 10 years or whatever, is that we should expect not necessarily decreased precipitation, but a slight increase possibly in precipitation across the West. And as they write, a mixed bag of wet and dry years in the Great Salt Lake Basin.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
I mean, this weather variability question complicates the management of every one of these lakes around the world. So a couple of years ago in Iran, they had a really wet year, and Lake Urmia rebounded by several feet. So this is a lake that's been completely destroyed by agricultural diversions. The government spiked the football and said, we've saved the lake. They'd spent multiple billions of dollars. We heard the comprehensive report on their efforts. They dredged a new river across the desert. They removed all of these illegal pumps. They said it's solved. Well, the next year, the lake dried up again because those ups and downs aren't what's affecting the long-term trajectory. These are, we call them flashy ecosystems. So they do go up and down naturally. People are going to see Great Salt Lake at times that it's higher or lower, but that's like a heartbeat going up and down. What we've done is we've attenuated the signal. And on top of that, it's going down more and more. And this gets back to where I completely agree with Matthew LaPlante and his study about chaos. So if we're in a system that has a lot of noise in it that goes up and down, then you actually have to keep it farther from the edge than you would need to if it was a flat system. Mm-hmm. And so we saw 3 years in a row, 2020 to 2022, of unprecedented extreme drought. The lake ended up dropping much faster than our water balance models projected. We talked with state agencies and researchers about this. There was a big difference there. The lake, it was a surprise how quickly the lake dropped. We think that a lot of that was actually because of groundwater depletion, not because of a long-term source that was unaccounted for that's going to stabilize the lake. That means that we can never let it get within 3 years or 2 years or even 5 years of that threshold. Right? We've got to be more cautious because of the chaos, not say, oh, yeah, the chaos is going to come save us. If you're trying to balance your bank account, don't count on those unexpected windfalls to make you solvent. You've got to say, I need to live within my means.
Ben Abbott is an associate professor of plant and wildlife sciences at Brigham Young University. Also with us is Bonnie Baxter. She's a professor of biology at Westminster University and the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute. They were the lead authors of a 2023 report calling for emergency measures to save Great Salt Lake. You can find a response from Matthew LaPlante to some of the ethical questions raised by Baxter and Abbott. It's on the webpage for this episode at RadioWest.org. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West and Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation about the condition and the future of Great Salt Lake. We have with us the ecologist Ben Abbott and biologist Bonnie Baxter. When you both look at the lake right now, where are we? And what are you thinking about in the context of what we've been discussing, but also what you're seeing, your own data, the data you're seeing from others? What are you seeing right now?
You know, the most important part of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem isn't the water. It's not the climate. It's the people. And I worry that in many ways we're in a worse situation now than we were in 2022 before those big water years, because the lake went from being the number one or number two issue in public concern to being number 16 based on polling from this summer. And so when we're thinking about what resources can we mobilize, how many people are focused on this, is this going to be a priority for lawmakers? All of that becomes more complicated if people aren't prioritizing the lake. And the short-term blip up has almost been depleted, right? We learned from the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office that the lake is approaching the level that it was at in 2021, just the year before its all-time low.
So the elevation right now is 4192.7.
I'll just tell listeners Bonnie's looking at her phone because this is the data.
No, this is today.
Today, okay.
That's South Arm.
Yeah.
This is South Arm elevation, correct, which is the part of the lake that's close to us and the part with the vibrant ecosystem. And this is where we were in the summer of 21. And the summer of 21 is when you, Doug, started doing these State of the Lake podcasts with Radio West. And I know that we felt a lot of urgency that summer of 21. So we're back at that same place. There is something that's different, though. And what's different is that the salinity is lower. The salinity is only about 12%. And that change happened because of the urgency that many of us scientists pushed for. And I sit on a salinity advisory committee for the state, and we suggested using the already in place causeway as a mitigator to prevent the salinity from the North Arm to have continual flow back into the South Arm. And by orchestrating some engineering at the breach in the causeway, and the governor made that happen, we were able to prevent a lot of salt rebound, and we're able to send some salt from the South Arm north. So we're able to manage the salt balance in a way that we weren't a couple of years ago when I was looking at my measurements that summer were 15 and 16%. So this is a much happier place for the brine shrimp and brine flies. We are managing the South Arm at the expense of the North Arm. But this is the part that is closest to the Wasatch Front, and it's the part that is the vibrant ecosystem that feeds these birds. So that's something that's very different, and that action happened because of the attention that we got to the lake.
So there's a group of researchers from various universities and agencies. It's called the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, and they are set to release their yearly report for lawmakers to consider during the legislative session. By the time this airs, in fact, that report will already have come out on Tuesday. But I did want to get a sense of from both of you, what are you expecting from the report? I know you're not on the strike team, either of you, but what do you think is going to be the message? How should we respond to that report?
We've spoken with some of the contributors to that report, and they're going to propose several flow targets So how much water do we need? How much extra water do we need to stabilize the lake where it is today? How much extra water do we need to refill it over 30 years? And I think that that's really helpful to have that range because it informs how much we need to decrease water flow. And then there's some new data about the dust, including the observation that we don't have the infrastructure in place to even know how much dust is coming from the lake, how it could be impacting public health.
I spent some time talking to folks on the strike team about salinity. So the focus on the strategy report last year was really about lake elevation and less about salinity. And as I just, pointed out, like depending on how you're dealing with the salt balance, the lake elevation may or may not reflect the salinity. In general, if the lake elevation goes down, you concentrate the salt and the water gets too salty. But that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand for various reasons. So I think that understanding the salinity requirements for all the species of life, including the water birds who have to ingest salt, understanding those thresholds is really an important part of what the strike team wants to think about. And they don't really have biologists, so they reach out and ask questions when they're working on biology. So
well, here then is, I guess, the natural follow-up. Are lawmakers in 2025 as primed to listen to those concerns or that information as they were in 2023 or any other time?
I mean, going back to 2022, 2021, there was amazing leadership from across the political spectrum.
Amazing.
Some of the most conservative, some of the most liberal members working together to solve this problem that was a threat to all of us in this community. There absolutely is good work. Speaker Mike Schultz last year pushed forward, along with Casey Snyder, this really important legislation regulating water use for mineral companies. Very important. I understand that there may be some work with the water conservation districts to try to increase water efficiency in urban landscapes. That's really helpful. But I think that many people have fallen into a place that I heard over and over again in Matthew LaPlante's reporting, that the lake does what it does. It goes up and it goes down. We don't impact it that much. So why should we expend the political capital or spend money on this issue? And that's terrifying to me as a researcher who studies global saline lakes. Because that is what was being said about the Aral Sea. That is what was being said about Lake Chad. That is what was being said about Mar Chiquita. Look, the lake used to be high. Now it's low. It's going to be high again. In the 1980s, the lake was not at flood stage. The lake was right near its long-term average. The reason why it was such a catastrophe is we built a bunch of stuff in the lake's footprint. Right? We put a freeway there. We put an airport there. The lake wasn't flooding. It was just about back to a healthy range. And now we're so far from there that we are saying we'll take 30 years to get back to the absolute minimum elevation that we need for the lake not to be compromised. And that's going to leave us just a couple of drought years away for that entire period of the lake dying and this whole cornucopia of unwanted consequences being released on our community. And so I'll say I said it was going to be the last thing, Doug, but here I go. The governor has accused us of doomerism when we gave what I say in full faith was our best effort at disclosing what we were seeing as researchers and advocates. Recently, Mark Burnett, a big TV producer, joined our advisory board at Grow the Flow, the group that I work with to advocate for better water policy. And he took us to task and said, you guys are burying the lead. You're talking about all of this stuff. You need to be way clearer and say, look, this is going to affect our property values. This is going to hurt our health. It's going to trash our fields. We're not going to be able to grow the food that we need to live here. You need to be way more direct. You're lost in the sauce. And I still, by culture am a scientist. For me, it's like, okay, be restrained. But there are real implications. And we've got to figure out as a people how to take that information and then how to act on it without our feelings getting hurt, right? I made a very insensitive comment in an interview. I called the legislature's efforts in 2023 a nothing burger. And this ended up being in the national news. I was totally off base. I apologized publicly, to Brad Wilson specifically, and he responded, and we've since had a good dialogue. That, I think, is what the governor is pushing us to do, right? When we are off base, when I speak from the seat of my pants, I want to take responsibility for it. But I'm not going to back down. I don't think Bonnie or any of the researchers and managers on this issue, we're not going to water down the issue.
Ben Abbott, he's an associate professor of plant and wildlife sciences at Brigham Young University. Bonnie Baxter is a professor of biology at Westminster University and the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube at KUER 90.1 and Instagram at Radio West. The program is produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.
For you.